Our speakers, you have their names and bios in your program. So to save time, because we would like to give them more time, and all of us more time to discuss what they have to say. It's Hassan Abbas. We are going to go in this sequence. Hassan Abbas, Emile Nakhleh, and Jennifer Bryanson. And myself eventually as a discussant. The speakers were given the 4 questions that Tom had given to all the presenters so that you understand how that might have influenced their presentations. I will just read the questions quickly because they may have chosen to disregard or to take on some of the questions, so you might get a sense of how that may have shaped their remarks. First, Tom sort of has a rather longish definition of a liberal Islamic political theology. And then he asks, comment as you wish on this definition. In your view, what are the central theological resources present in Islam that might yield a liberal Islamic political theology so defined? Second question, what are the barriers within Islamic theology, history, and current sociology that might inhibit the development of such political theology? Third, to what extent can and should the United States, in its democracy policies and programs and its international religious freedom policy, attempt to encourage the development of an Islamic liberal political theology? Fourth, what recommendations would you make to the Obama administration with respect to its democracy and international religious freedom policies in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, and Iran? So those were the questions that were put to the presenters without an obligation to address any or all of them, but to consider them as they prepare their remarks. So we're going to listen to about 12-15 minutes of each presentation, with myself adding some comments and open up for general discussion. Okay, Hassan.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. In about next 12 minutes, I want to begin with some of the issues that were raised in the last panel, just some phrases and a couple of comments, and then I'll come to these, the 4 questions. There were some comments made about President Obama's or this administration's approach towards the Muslim world. And I think I must add that especially what he said in the Cairo speech, secondly, what he had said in his talk to university students in Turkey, that was a huge difference than the way issues were framed in the previous administration. And yes, there were no details about any specific human rights issues or any of the intricacies involved. But his major point was that he's talking about a relationship which is based on trust and respect. I think, in my personal view, he got that exactly correctly, because it's not about all the variations of democracy in Islam and the differences that the West has. It is not about the definitional issues about Sharia. It is about how also United States in general, or in specific, and West in general, is seen in the Muslim world. That's why I think, of course, in 10 minutes, we were not expecting that there will be a transformational change. But if the issues are framed accurately, that in itself is a big step forward. The second point is, there was some brief talk about that, yes, United States, through its policies, can create space in the Muslim world for moderates or modernists or whatever name we would like to give. I would add to that, it's not only about creating space for some elements which may become controversial. It is also about not supporting those elements who, for any reason, are known for their authoritarianism and anti-democratic credentials. Just 2 examples, and then I'll come to the issues what I think this administration can do, or United States in general as a matter of policy can do. One example is that of Pakistan and another of Afghanistan. In case of Pakistan, contrary to some of the journal views and beliefs, the people in the country have been trying time and again to go for a democratic model. I can't think of any other country where there were 4 military dictatorships, and at the end of each, in almost all 4 cases, those military dictators supported by the West in general and United States in particular, but the people of the country always trying to throw out dictators and go for resurgence of democracy. Benazir Bhutto, the late Benazir Bhutto in 2007 was co-opted in a sense that there was an effort by the Bush administration to help her go back and for restarting the democratic process. But she was pushed to have a deal with Musharraf, a military dictator, who was already, his credentials were sinking. So in the process of just keeping alive one dictator, Benazir Bhutto was pushed to stand with her, so much so that she got killed. So in the process of trying to choreograph a democratic change, we even lost some of the hope the country had for democracy. Same for Afghanistan. It is after 8 years, 8 years ago, Karzai was supported. There was a constitutional development in Afghanistan after the military action, which I think the constitutional of Afghanistan today is a great document. It was a great effort. But after 8 years, if we are making an argument that in those 8 years we were expecting that the democratic institutions will get established, despite having a focus on Iraq, very little or meager resources for Afghanistan, failure of the international community to live to its promises about investment, about reconstruction, about schools and about hospitals, and despite having an overemphasis on the military aspect, despite that failing to find out the Al-Qaeda leadership, and at the end of the 8 years, we are saying, oh, can democracy work in Afghanistan? The policy failures are so huge, and without recognizing that there were serious policy mistakes, to frame the issue as whether democracy can work or secular democracy can work in Afghanistan or not, I think is a faulty question. About 5 things which I think I'll jump to what this administration can do in the Muslim world, and then explain what are the ingredients of democracy or liberal democratic political thought within the Muslim world already. But the 5 things which I think can be done. First, very clearly, United States has to be very clear. Whether it is supporting democracy or democratic institutions in any Muslim country as a matter that it suits the interests of a state, any state, or whether it is supported as an ideal, that democracy as an ideal is something which as a value we should support. Because it is entirely possible that these 2 goals will be contradictory to each other at some point. Which of the ideals will be a priority? The only point I'm making in this first category is it has to be consistent. Whatever it is, it can be both. Democracy, because it suits US interests, security interests, or support of democracy as an ideal in itself. Whatever that is, it has to be consistent. You can't afford to be selective, because as soon as you're selective, the whole focus, the whole message, the whole mission gets discredited. Second point. United States, in this effort to support democracy, and I'll come to that, what kind of democracy and why, but in this effort to support democracy project, United States should avoid at all costs to get into anything that is sectarian or support of any mainstream or major or smaller sectarian group. Number 3, there should never be an attempt to prop up any secular or liberal scholars. What I mean by that is, there are many within the Muslim world already. Maybe we are at times failing to recognize. For example, in case of Pakistan, there are so many religious leaders who are very conservative, very orthodox, very militant, very extremist. They have excellent websites. They have excellent propaganda materials. They have support base as well. But parallel to them, there are people like those of you who follow Pakistan. There is a group, Barelvi group led by Tahir al-Qadri. There is another one, a scholar by the name of Javed Ghamdi. JavedGhamdi.com is his website, who have challenged extremists within Pakistan, and they have become so popular that many news channels, and by the way, Pakistan has about 24-hour news channels, independent news channels. Many of the news channels are vying with each other who will get this guy for a talk on religion. But those are the kind of people who are already making a struggle. We need not think of a scholar, try to support that. There are people within the Muslim world. You may not agree with everything that they say, but they might have much more credibility in their own domains. The fourth point is about education. Even if there's a country where there's dictatorship or autocracy or any other authoritarian system of government, support to education in itself will have a huge impact. And that I link this with the barriers to liberal political thought in the Muslim world. I think the madrasa education, as it stands today, has played the most significant role in the degeneration of religious political thought. You might not be able to transform or change or reform that madrasa, but in all the major Muslim countries, there is a parallel public education system. Investing in those public education systems, which will not be controversial, which will not be seen as supporting any religious group or will not be seen as supporting any specific political group, but public education, that in itself make a lot of difference. And the fifth point, what can be done, is also, for instance, in many Muslim countries, United States has different interests and different kind of interaction with these countries. But let's again, I'm quoting Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkey, and Indonesia. 4 countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Indonesia, and Turkey. At any given point in time, rather than supporting their militaries for any reason, for counterterrorism, for their regional policy, for their regional security, for their cooperation with NATO, for instance, in comparison to that, if their police institutions and law enforcement institutions would have been established or would have been supported, there would have been a huge difference in society. Why? In counterterrorism, military has a very specific way of going against a certain threat. But as soon as law enforcement and police goes for certain investigation, you have to prepare a case, it has to be legal, it has to be according to a certain law, civil or religious law, whatever. But you have to prepare a case, it has to go in a court, there is a process involved. Wherever there are law enforcement and police organizations which are strong, the democracy has a much more chance of getting nurtured or getting strengthened. Same in the case of Pakistan and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, massive funding went into developing Afghan army. The ones who were developing this strategy should have known that in South Asia and Central Asia, whenever there is a military general or military institution which is supported, they ultimately come and take over the country. There is a history of 400 years, 500 years in that case. Whereas law enforcement agencies would have been more effective against terrorism, against extremism, and would have been effective tools in the hands of democratic leaders. Now, very briefly, I think I hardly have 4 or 5 minutes left, if that's the case. Two. And I still have to make the most important point, I think, but I'll be very brief. In terms of what are the ingredients within the Muslim societies and state which can really strengthen this liberal Islamic political thought, the idea that was, or the definition that was given to us. I think we must first recognize that the modern democracy for the Muslim world is a borrowed idea. And you all understand better than me that in the Western world, in Europe, in the United States, there are hundreds of years which these countries went through a certain process, development of certain ideas, conceptions. For the Muslim world, the modern state and the modern democratic institution, as we see in the West, is a post-World War II phenomena. So there's no need to be impatient and really disappointed and for any hopelessness in the idea of democracy in the Muslim world, because it is comparatively very, very new, comparatively. And it will take its own time and its own process. The only thing we can ensure from the West or from outside is to at least see that the direction is right. Secondly, what are the basic those ingredients within the Muslim world? I think what my reading of Quran, and we are lucky to have Mr. Naeem here, who's a real expert in this field, and he can tell us more about it. But within Quran, the religious text for Muslims, there is no mention, though no specific mention of any political system. It would have been a huge problem, for instance, if Quran or Hadith is the sayings or the doings of the Prophet, if there was a specific verse or something specific in support of authoritarianism. There's none. So but there are principles of governance, and those are, to my understanding, and from various leading experts have mentioned these at various points. For instance, one is establishing the system of justice. Second is security of the people. Third, and a very important one in that, is the whole concept of ijtihad, which is your independent judgment on a certain issue. Then there's issue of consensus building for policy making. My argument is that the 4 or 5 basic precepts about governance, about ruling, are only possible in a democratic model. Those institutions, those principles that religion give, for instance, cannot be fully implemented or effectively established in an authoritarian or autocratic regime. The second point is, for instance, there are some serious issues about women's rights, for instance, how we look from a Western liberal secular perspective. There are serious issues about minority rights, about rights of non-Muslims. Just 2 basic references, and then I'll close. One is the Charter of Medina, which the Prophet Muhammad had signed this contract, which is called Charter of Medina, which is very clear that each different community, at that time the issue was about Muslims and Jews, that each of the community can not only go according to, or perform their lives, or live their lives according to their own religion precepts, but can also, there was no restriction or no limitation. Similarly, in terms of governance, I would refer to this one famous letter by the 4th Caliph of Islam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, which he had written to governor of Egypt, about governance. I would highly encourage you, those of you who are interested in this, it's available on the internet everywhere, just Ali's letter to the governor of Egypt. The governance model that is provided in that letter, for instance, which I assume, and the belief is, which he drew from the Islamic concepts, is something which fits very well and almost exactly into a democratic model, or which can nurture democracy. So my, again, point is that there are issues. We know about religious extremists and the way they are framing the issue, but there is enough within the mainstream religious discourse which can be built upon, and which we may not get exactly what we see as Western secular model of democracy, but some form of democracy which you may call Muslim democracy or Islamic democracy might be possible. I'll close.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Emile?
Thank you. The comments this afternoon are informed by not only my academic background, but frequent visits and conversations with hundreds of Muslim interlocutors in dozens of Muslim countries over the last 2 decades, and by our analysis of over 100 political parties across the Muslim world, and by a paper I just completed on the study of Sharia. I want to focus on the questions that Eric and Tom sent to us. And I would like to begin by saying that, first, before I start the truth in advertisement, I am not a Muslim. I am a Catholic from Nazareth. And I always say 2 of us come from there. One was crucified, and I worked at CIA. But the point I am making here is that this analysis has been really grounded in what is happening on the ground and the recent developments since the early 90s. And interviews particularly with Islamic political parties, both in and out of government. The first point I want to make about the whole analysis of Islamic political theology and Sharia, as I wrote in my response, that we need really to divide it into 2 major parts. The first is that the development of Sharia about governance occurred in a whole different era, in what we call Dar al-Islam, where Muslim majority countries existed, where Islam was not only the majority, but the government, and the whole discussion was colored by that reality. That is no longer the case. We no longer have really Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. We have Muslims live 1.5 billion all over the world. And that development has colored currently the discussion of Sharia. The second point is that we truly cannot talk about one Islamic world. I mean, we have the whole day talked about Islam and democracy, and the Muslim world and democracy. The fact is, there are many Muslim worlds, many theories of Sharia, many discussions of governance. The Muslims of Indonesia are not the same as the Muslims of Turkey. Their attitude is different. Their views on Sharia are different. And their views of governance are different. They are colored by historical narratives, by geographic experiences, by cultural experiences, by tribal experiences. And so therefore, it becomes very difficult, really, and problematic for us to discuss the concept of Sharia and governance for the whole Islamic world. And I mean, I remember briefing senior policymakers on this point, and every time they would understand it. And then a week later, something happens, and then I'll get the tasking from downtown. What does the Muslim world think about this? and so there isn't any one particular view. The third point I want to make is that currently, the discussion of Sharia and the Caliphate, that radical extreme, if you will, of Islamic governance, is for the most part, is being carried out by radical groups. I mean, if you talk to mainstream Islamic parties, they'll tell you Sharia is nice, is fine, but we have no time for it. When I asked a Hamas person after the 2006 elections, okay, now you got elected and you won the elections, when are you going to implement Sharia? He looked at me, he said, Sharia, give me a break. He said, we have no time for it. He said, I need to deal with Israel about work permits, about the power grid, about commerce, about resources. I have no time for Sharia. And the same thing, a conversation I had with AKP people, but before that with the Islamic Party in Turkey. The same thing with PAS in Malaysia, and the same thing with PKS in Indonesia. So the discussion of Sharia today is really carried on by bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, especially the Caliphate, by Hizb ut-Tahrir in Indonesia and other places, and by IMU in Uzbekistan. Mainstream Islamic parties, including the Muslim Brotherhood, view the Caliphate as a nice goal, but it's not really, it's kind of a vision. It's not something they are either going to work for, or as one Muslim Brotherhood person told me, we're not going to spend resources and effort to bring about the Caliphate. That's gone. The fourth point I want to make is that while the whole discussion was about Islam and democracy, we really need to keep in mind that today we no longer have an Islamic world based on Ummah. We have an Islamic world consisting of many, many different states that even Islamic political parties have come to accept as a given. That is the nation state. But what we see happening is that the rise of religion, for religions as a factor and as a driver of foreign policy in the behavior of states and non-state actors, mostly in the context of religious nationalist ideology, rather than straight religion. And in fact, these Islamic political parties, they have learned one lesson in these elections, and that is that if they overemphasize their Islamic credentials, they will not get votes. Before Hamas was elected during their campaign, there were reports, media reports, that they talked to AKP in Turkey and they talked to PAS in Malaysia. And basically, they asked them, what do they advise them to do during the campaign? Both parties told them to minimize their Islamic credentials. And in fact, during the campaign, Hamas candidates had nice suits, nicely trimmed beards. They never mentioned their Islamic credentials, but they talked about two aspects. One, their ideology of resistance, muqawama, and 2, their service to the community. When PAS in 2004 lost one of the 2 states in Malaysia, I went over there and I asked them to assess the reason for their loss. One of them said is that because we tried to be too Muslim, too much Islamic, and that the next election they changed their agenda. So the point here is that this discussion of Sharia today and the Caliphate is really on the fringe of Islamic activism worldwide. That mainstream Islamic parties are playing the game of politics, and you might raise a question whether this is a tactical or strategic. I'm prepared to begin to argue that it is moving in the strategic direction. They have passed the test of one man, one vote, one time. They have participated in multiple elections, and they have continued to get the legitimacy and support of their community. The 5th point I want to make is that even though once the 4 schools in classical Islam, in Sunni Islam, closed and concluded what Sharia was, what governance was, even though they range on the spectrum from the Hanbali, the most conservative school in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to perhaps the Hanafi and the Shafi'i. Once they closed that door, ijtihad or reasoning stopped. What we see in the last 100 years is that this door is beginning to open up. It opened up with the 3 famous reformists, Afghani, Abdu, and Rida, but more recently, to me, is more important, is that it's opening up today outside the heartland of Islam. It's opening up by scholars and thinkers, including our moderator in the United States, in Europe, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, outside. But this ijtihad really is so important because for the first time, Muslims view themselves living in Muslim minority countries. I don't mean Indonesia and Malaysia, but in the West. And they are trying to find what I would call MMJ, Muslim minority jurisprudence, to how to reconcile faith with active citizenship. Not faith with passive citizenship, but they are calling on their compatriots to reconcile faith with active citizenship in Christian non-Muslim countries. If you look at the 2 extremes of Sharia today, you find that for the most part, Islamic parties, Islamic organizations, Islamic thinkers have taken a pragmatic view towards Sharia, have taken a view that Sharia should really take into consideration developments in those different countries. And on the other hand, you find the radical, the Taliban type example of Sharia. I looked in my Sharia paper on two opposite extremes, one the Taliban and their view of Sharia, and one the Islamic movement in Israel. The Islamic movement in Israel consists of over 1 million people. No one really has recently studied it. There was an article this past year by a professor, Israeli professor in a Middle East journal, which I thought was very good. And it showed how the Islamic movement in Israel has taken a pragmatic approach to Sharia, has learned to agree to disagree with Israeli authorities, and has come to accept Israeli government's legislation on gender equality, even though some radical conservative elements within the Islamic movement have said, well, Sharia says that man that the woman is not equal to man. Israeli legislation said, no, both are equal, and if you as a woman want to question a ruling by the Qadi, you can go to civil courts. And that's what happened in Israel as an example of how the Islamic movement has accepted a pragmatic view of Sharia. Finally, I want to say that So what? I always used to ask my analysts at the end of whenever they write a paper, I say, you've got to answer this question, so what? So what does it mean to us? How can we, in the context of this pragmatic, changing view of Sharia, how can we deal with this issue when we have already established, as the President has done, as Secretary of State has done, when we have established a distinction between the 1% radicals and the 99% mainstreamers? And how do we engage the 99% of 1.5 billion Muslims? The President, I thought, gave an excellent speech in Cairo, and the underlying assumption in that speech was that we are going to engage Muslim communities vice regimes. And that two, that there is tremendous diversity and complexity in the Muslim world. And that three, if engagement is going to succeed, it's got to involve practical, pragmatic issues, as that person from Hamas was telling me about. And I thought the speech that Secretary Clinton gave this afternoon, really, in Morocco, and she raised three specific issues of engagement in science and technology, education, and women's rights. But these issues, if they are going to succeed, they have to be based on this assumption that there is tremendous diversity, that we need to engage Muslim communities as partners, engaging, by the way, in the process, the American Muslim community on issues that are of concern to local villages, local communities. You know, for years, I've always said for years, we've engaged Western-educated, English-speaking, Scotch-drinking Muslims. The other day when I said that in Dubai last week, somebody in the back of the room stood up and said, no, not Scotch, single malt. So it's single malt Muslims. Well, the fact is today that vast majorities of Muslims are not college educated, are not Scotch drinkers, are not English speakers. When you go to villages in the Fergana Valley, you are in a whole different world than the elites of Cairo. And so you need to engage those people and to engage them as a two-way street on issues that they do understand. Frankly, if you go and discuss Sharia or religious freedom in the philosophical terms, on the philosophical level with a women's organization in a village in Central Asia, in the Fergana Valley, they look at you and say, what the hell are you talking about? We are interested in spousal abuse issues, child hygiene issues. These are not political at all. But we have kind of moved away from that. And my really plea to this administration is to go back to these. And I would like to say that I'm heartened to see a move in that direction.
Thank you very much. Jennifer?
My comments will mostly address the third and fourth questions that were posed to us. And first, I want to start with what I think are some general principles that I would hope would be considered in the Obama administration in engaging Muslim communities and dealing with democracy. The first is the word democracy. I'm very sympathetic to Gerald Hyman's concerns that terms like good governance and rule of law, while good, are not enough. And also Dan Brumberg's concern that liberalization is good but not enough. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that in some Muslim communities, there's a lot of misinterpretation, a lot of confusion and fear about the term democracy. There are other Muslims who completely get it. I mean, from the Danish Muslim parliamentarian with democracy in Arabic tattooed on his arm to civil society activists I know of in Egypt who could out-lecture most Americans on the core components of democracy. But in other communities, there's a lot of misinterpretation. As a Jordanian friend of mine would say, when you Americans say democracy, my family hears 16-year-old girls dressed like Britney Spears. And we also need to consider there's a very large youth demographic in some Muslim majority areas, which means you've got a generation that is very post-Cold War. In addition to that, when the United States stood up the National Endowment for Democracy, USIP was developing, and a lot of these other institutions that promoted democracy, at that time, during the Cold War, we had the US Information Agency, which communicated to foreign populations. And with the anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down, let me give you a personal example. In the 1980s, teenage rebellion comes in many forms. I went and studied Marxism-Leninism in East Germany at the Karl Marx University in Leipzig. And I would go up to Berlin to the American embassy in East Berlin, and in the library, I would check out books, and I would photocopy them, and I would bring them back, and I would give them to my friends quietly in Leipzig, mostly my Polish friends, who were very intellectually engaged on these issues, and they would share them like crazy. And the books that were placed in the embassy at the time were very substantive and thoughtful. Somebody had really thought about what books they were putting in the embassy. So by the time the wall came down, you had a lot of people who had thought about these things and understood, and you had a tremendously peaceful transition. Well, today we have these arms like NED, but USIA has been basically abolished, folded into the State Department. State Department's job is government-to-government relations. Public diplomacy needs to engage foreign populations. Its budgets have been cut dramatically. So as we move forward in looking at promoting democracy, we also have a job to explain what we mean by that. The next principle that I think we need to consider, and a change I would like to see going forward, is consideration for freedom of religion within majority communities. A lot of our US government freedom of religion work has focused on minorities, and that's important because minorities are often the ones who don't have a voice to speak for them. If you're a Baha'i in Egypt, life's not very good. But we also need to consider freedom of religion within majority communities, and here I look again at Egypt. The Egyptian government has ceded to Al-Azhar the approval process for publication of books that deal with Islam. And Al-Azhar has defined dealing with Islam extremely broadly. And so this means that there's just astonishing squashing of efforts by Sunni Muslims within Egypt to engage in substantive and challenging discussion about interpretations of modern Islam. One book that I think of was a collection of essays by Muhammad Futuh that I'm currently translating from Arabic into English that was confiscated the day it was published in Egyptian bookstores. And it's a very mild-mannered, sometimes he's a bit spirited, but mostly mild-mannered argument in favor of teaching critical thinking in the schools, of helping to develop democratic citizens by teaching children to challenge and question. These are the types of books that the Egyptian government is allowing to be banned. So we need to keep an eye out for issues of religious freedom and freedom of expression in majority communities. And my last broad point is our overall approach, I think, should not be to promote a liberal Islamic political theology. I think our approach needs to affirm the primacy of substantive defense of one's views and being open to being challenged substantively. We need to create and protect space for differences of opinion and give primacy to the fact that public civil argumentation is the way you resolve those differences. I don't think that we should look at a track race and bet all our money on one track person, one of the runners. thinking there's just going to be one race. We need to affirm the idea there's going to keep being races and they need to be fair and everybody needs to have a chance to participate. I want to close with some comments that are a little bit different than some of the comments we've had today, in that I want to be really specific about what I think some of these ideas would look like. Yesterday, Professor Naeem asked me, well, okay, you know, that sounds nice, but what does this look like? How do we do this? So some of the ideas I'm going to suggest are things that, you know, Wednesday morning in the office, if you're a State Department staffer, a congressional staffer, or you have friends who are congressional staffers, things that you can do to start tomorrow between 9 and 10 a.m. And these specific examples aren't necessarily exactly the projects we should move forward on, but just to give you an idea of how some of these ideas could translate into programs. One is in the State Department, in educational and cultural affairs. They have a tremendous exchange program. I think there's opportunities to align that exchange program more with the priorities of the US government in foreign policy. After the International Religious Freedom Act, there's really an opportunity to leverage existing institutions such as the educational and cultural affairs exchanges to help promote religious freedom, to offer trips and exchanges to look at practices of religious freedom and peaceful pluralism of multiple religious groups. And the one reason I'm being so specific is, you know, we may only have 3 years. On my wish list, I can think of big level changes, but in looking at things that we could actually move from idea to action. Another one is I would love to see a freedom fund at the National Endowment for the Arts to help with the publication and translation of banned books. One of the most important ways that I see happening in Muslim communities overseas in trying to maneuver past censors and trying to deal with tremendously complex transitions is there are very talented and sophisticated creative writers doing amazing things right now in novels where characters are maneuvering through some of these changes and are challenging assumptions and are presenting their case for living as Muslims in peaceful pluralism from a theological point of view through characters who are having arguments with the religious establishment. In addition to that, some of these novels are exciting and fun and could reach broad populations, but they're mostly banned. The novels being written in Arabic out of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and some other areas, if they get published, they're usually published by obscure boutique Arabic language publishers in Europe. So we have existing institutions like the National Endowment for the Arts. I think that we could do a lot by helping to shed some light on banned books. And just one last one, focusing again on books. The State Department has a book program, but it's still very much in a 1980s Cold War stance of, well, we need to tell people about America. I think we need to start leveraging some of these existing programs like the book program to make books available in other languages and not just print, nowadays also electronic and audio, that are going to communicate some of the main ideas that will help to build the frameworks that are going to be needed to move forward.
Thank you so much. I think our panelists have been so disciplined that I have to try to match that by having just a few remarks to add. And my difficulty, of course, is that I agree with everything they said. So what can I say? Maybe just to bring, in fact, being the subversive I am, please excuse me, Tom and Eric, I would like to question the premise of the whole panel. That is the idea that the United States can actually promote democracy in any way, anywhere, or any country doing it anywhere else. I think my sense is that the nature of democracy is such that it cannot be promoted from without. It has to be homegrown, it has to be nurtured and built over time. There are no shortcuts. Now, it could be that with various types of facilities that we have, technology that we have, can in fact societies can take less time than this country had taken to come where it is now. But I think that every place has to do it on its own and its own way. In fact, I published a comment on President Obama's speech in Cairo that was published in The Guardian in England. And my question was to say that change has to come to the Muslim world from within. It cannot be done from without. But in any case, I think that the point is that by raising, because the comment I noticed earlier in the panels is what works, or how much has this worked or the other worked. Assuming that something will work in promoting democracy elsewhere. And so I'm just raising this question so that we think about it. Maybe nothing will work in that sense of the United States actually promoting democracy by its own action anywhere else. Having done that, let me move on to just add a couple of points. I think we have a problem with concepts and terms. Terminology is very critical and very sometimes ambiguous. Theology, for example, I mean, in the questions that were put, a liberal political theology. Each word of this phrase is problematic in translation. And translation not just simply in language, but in cultural and intellectual and epistemological sense. Liberal, political, theology, and so on. So that's another caution. Hassan referred to the idea that the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet have nothing to say on a form of government or a way of government as such. And that is very true. In fact, the word state does not occur a single time in the whole of the Quran and in the whole of the Sunnah of the Prophet. And when I make that claim, I make it because I have tested it. There are CD-ROMs where you can put the Quran in and do a word search for the word state. And you can put in a CD-ROM which contains all the hadith manuals and put the word state. It will not come up a single time. It did not, neither source addressed institutions. They always address people, either believers as individuals or as communities, but never institutions. The values, I think that Hassan was the point that I was making, and completely agrees, the values are completely there. I mean, accountability, transparency, justice, very, very, very powerful language. So it is not the lack of resources, but I think we need to look somewhere else to understand what's going on. I think my point is to say that, again, resonating with what all three speakers did say, I think the problems that we may have with democratization, as Hassan said also, and Emile said, it's a question of time frame, it's a question of institutions, and not for the lack of desire for it, not for the lack of drive for it. And people, in fact, sacrifice and risk a lot in terms of their own personal safety and their families' well-being to stand for these issues and causes. It is not for the lack of political will among people. It is understanding the post-colonial nature of the struggle. I think, as Hassan said, I mean, these countries are very recent. Often I put the point that let us compare the United States 60 years from its own independence and any of these countries now 60 years from its own independence. That is the fair comparison, not comparing the United States 200 years after independence with countries which have become independent only 40 or 50 years ago. And again, the idea of the nation state as a European colonial idea that has come to be imposed to stay, probably for the time being at least, but it is not indigenous, and therefore there are problems with legitimacy with the very idea of the state. And so much of that we tend to take for granted should not be taken for granted, I think, in those situations. I think it's a very much fundamentally a question about underdevelopment, political instability, poverty, lack of education. Those are the issues, the real issues. As Emile was saying, for which people will strongly resonate. And as Jennifer said also, that there are internal solutions and a very powerful discourse on all of these issues. To come back to conclude with my opening skepticism about what the United States can do, it is everything else that the United States does that makes more difference than what it does on so-called democracy promotion and human rights promotion. That is, the entire foreign policy of the United States is what is at issue. the real priorities of the United States have to be reflected and integrated in every aspect of its foreign policy. You cannot have a foreign policy on the promotion of democracy, whatever number of millions you put to it, and sort of contradictory and very sort of subversive elements of the same foreign policy from the same American embassy come very mixed signals everywhere. And the stronger signals are not signals for democracy or human rights protection. In fact, they cannot be. Because the United States is a very powerful, a very complicated, and very global power. And its priorities, foreign policy priorities, are very complex and contingent and conflicting. So the pretense that we can carry on doing promotion of democracy and human rights protection and carry on all other business as usual is something that we need to question. My point is to say that whatever you can do for promoting democracy and human rights protection, do it in all that you do. Particularly, I think, development assistance, education. I very much, I think I'm echoing Emile's remarks here about development, education, health. Those are the issues for which people care. Those are the issues for which the goodwill of the United States will come across very strong and clear. People will know and understand and respect that. But when you talk about democracy and human rights, as Jennifer was saying, people get suspicious and start questioning your motivation. There is a very powerful American institution that I have come to admire. I'm from Sudan. I came to live in this country for about 15 years now. The public library. Yes. This is an amazing institution. And it is everywhere. And it's so rich, and it's so comforting, and so receptive. I mean, I think the people who run these places should be given national medals. Help promote the idea of a public library. Jennifer was talking about books. And instead of just having to go to the American embassy, it should be in every neighborhood. And where people can check out CDs and check out DVDs and engage really in creative. There is so much to life that people everywhere appreciate and respect and love and look for. Help with that, and you will help with the promotion of democracy that is sustainable. Absolutely. And that's worthwhile. With those remarks, I think I will open up for your comments, questions. We have a mic that will go around on this side, please. Yeah. And let me see a couple of hands on this side. Okay.
My name is Ali Al-Yami from the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia here in Washington, D.C. I have so many comments and questions, but I'll try to be brief. I heard this discussion, this discourse about 40 years ago. It's still the same. Nothing has changed in the discourse, nor have anything changed in Arab and Muslim countries. Arabs and Muslims are the most backward people on this planet. I disagree that we cannot export democracy, and I'm not saying shove it in people's throat. But we should not be supporting dictators that deny their people the choices if they want to have democracy in their countries, such as in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Pakistan, and the list goes on. We export democracy to Eastern Europe, to Japan, to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, to South Korea, to many other places, South Africa, so it can be exported not through the gun, but through a solid policy that are predicated in the United States democratic institutions. That's what it should be done. When we talk about Muslims, we talk about 1.5, as you said, 1.5 billion Muslims. We don't talk about anybody. You are right. Muslims, Islam is practiced differently in different countries, but not in substance, but in degrees. So we should be talking about individual countries. And if you really want to talk about individual countries and go to the root causes of lack of democracies, you go to Saudi Arabia, which paid this institution $20 million to start a center here. What I would like to this school does is ask the Saudis to open a center in Imam Muhammad University for the Catholic religion. That would be a good exchange, actually. My question would be, if you know that Islam is not compatible with democracy because Islam has been here for 14 and a half centuries, there has never been one single democratic country since Islam came, and Islam is a belief, has nothing to do with public life, policy, eat, drink, medicine, sciences, then why should you not promote things that have worked? Independent, democratic institutions that respond to people's daily needs and leave religion to people, whether they want to believe in or not to believe in, that's their problem.
Thank you. Would anyone like to respond? Or shall we take a few, maybe, because then the respondents can integrate the questions. Right here by the camera and then in the back. But, show her.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask the panel's opinion on the issue of engagement and disengagement, for that matter, because I haven't heard anybody discuss the disengagement aspect of democracy promotion. Mr. Nakhleh mentioned different views among Muslims around the world, and that is very true. But I don't think anybody would deny that there is an overwhelming majority, almost a consensus, about some very crucial issues, like Israel, like America's occupation of Iraq, like America's military operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And American foreign policy has caused the death of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Iraqis. If we take it from the embargo of the 1990s up until the current war, thousands of Afghanis, thousands of Pakistanis. The bombing of weddings is definitely not a promotion of democracy or anything else. So the disengagement, the military disengagement, is that a precondition for any form of other kinds of engagement? Libraries are very nice, but the F-16s are not. And we're getting more F-16s than books, definitely. And the other thing is, with the banned books and publishing them, I mean, if the publications of Martin Luther came out in Istanbul at the time, you would have no reformation in Western Christianity. I mean, it has to do with what you promote. And America is not a friendly figure in the imagination of many Muslims because of all this blood that America has been shedding and because of the alliance between America and Israel.
Can you get to a question, please?
If America is promoting this, I don't know how that's going to help democracy or anything else. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one more, and then we can, all the speakers can respond to any or all of them.
There was a professor at Catholic University who several years ago promoted programs where he brought in intellectuals from Lithuania or Poland and had them explore their own traditions of democracy, of civil society. And perhaps that might be something that the US government or other groups such as NED or whatever could think about, which would be something similar for people from Muslim societies, and that would not necessarily have to be limited to intellectuals.
Thank you. So the panelists can respond to any of the questions.
If I may just take a minute or two. Please forgive me, I do not want to advertise my book, The Necessary Engagement, that Princeton put out. But in the last chapter, there is a blueprint, a 10-point blueprint of specific programs of how to engage with the Islamic world. And all of those, most of those are not new at all. They've been done, been attempted. There are a couple, two, 3 points in the blueprint that are new, but the others have been done. But the book calls for expansion of those programs, from books to exchanges with students and professionals to everything else across the gamut of engagement. You raised a very good point, the gentleman there, with the question that, and public opinion polls have really confirmed this issue, that in the last 7-8 years, when we analyze public opinion polls, the Pew poll, the Gallup poll, and a number of others, we got the clear impression from the polling data that disagreements with the United States was not, by Muslims that is, Muslim disagreements with the United States, those disagreements were not driven by values of good governance, they were driven by specific policies. That was clear in almost every poll. And when we dug deeper and asked what those specific policies were, they identified Iraq, Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban, Gitmo, that is Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, the Arab-Israeli issue, Israeli-Palestinian issue, and things of that sort. So they identified, and all of those were under this rubric, the war on Islam, that the perception was that by painting the whole Islamic world with the broad brush of terrorism, under this GWAT, Global War on Terror, we gave the impression that the United States was engaged in a war against Islam. So those policies were the issues that fueled that conflict. So you are right about that. So the military engagement or disengagement was part of the policies that were identified. In terms of regimes, I mean, we are a huge country with national interests, global interests. So we do have to engage regimes as we did not just before, after 9/11, but before, for national security issues. And we would have to continue to do so. The president, in his speech in Cairo, made that issue about engaging communities, vice regimes. That was a very important, nuanced word included in the speech. And he basically tried to say that we will continue to engage regimes for national security issues, but if we are going to contribute to the creation of an environment that is conducive to democratic ideals, you've got to engage communities from below. And on issues ranging from science and technology in high school and grade school education, to health and hygiene, micro-investment, energy, clean water. These issues have to be engaged at the community level. So he did not see a contradiction. In fact, in a briefing, and I cited that in the book, that perhaps to be more honest and less hypocritical about these regimes, not only we should stop using the phrase war on terror, which we have, excuse me, the government has, but we should perhaps revisit the term moderate that we assign to these regimes. I mean, in reality, there is nothing moderate about denial of human rights, denial of women's rights, denial of freedoms of speech and assembly, denials of publishing of books, denials of making films and movies, and stage plays and so on. Well, these regimes that engage in this cannot possibly be moderate. So I think, to be honest, we should call them either friendly regimes or pro-US regimes, and that's it. There's nothing moderate about Saudi Arabia or Egypt or many of those regimes. So let's stop calling them moderate and say they are pro-US or friendly. And that's it.
Thank you.
I'd like to address the books issue in 3 ways. First, on the issue, well, can America promote these books? I suppose you mean the US government when you say America. First, I want to talk about private sector role. One study looking at the barriers to circulation of constructive works in Arab countries found that the best way to make a banned novel in Arabic well-known in Arab countries is to translate the novel into English, and then when major Western papers do a book review on the novel by an Arab author, doing the book review on the English version, they traced that then Pan-Arab dailies started to pick up on the novels. Then Pan-Arab dailies would write reviews of the books, and then the books would become well-known in Arab countries. It's a bit counterintuitive, but there's a bunch of specific examples of this working. As for the US government being involved in cultural activities, I think this gets to the fact that we need to foster environments in which ideas are evaluated on their substance and on their own legs, not on who the publisher was. If I were to tell you right now, hey, the sun is shining outside, the response would hopefully be to look and see whether or not the sun is shining, not to say you're an American, therefore I'm not going to believe you. And there is a public role by the government to play in helping to foster the circulation of ideas that are in our national interest. I would love to see greater private sector engagement, but until such time, there are branches of the US government, such as the State Department Public Diplomacy, that have budgets and expertise in this. Third comment, yes to public libraries. Promoting public libraries is tremendously important in this.
A few points. First about this books idea, and an example from Pakistan, partly also to project my own work, but partly to make the point. My experience of writing a book, a revisionist history of Pakistan, so to say, and also talking about how religious extremists or religious conservatives were able to expand their role within Pakistan step by step. And when it was published from New York and was then published from India and went to Pakistan, to my utter surprise, I was expecting that it will be banned. It was not. And instead, I received so many calls from my colleagues. I'm originally from Pakistan. I've been in US for the last 9 years in academia, but previous to that, I received so many calls from academia, from government officials and others that can you connect us with some good publishing house in the United States? Because the problem was that during the Afghan war, so many publishing houses were nurtured, supported by Pakistani government, madrasas, outsiders as well, that if I want to publish today in Pakistan, despite Pakistan's democratic experience, civil society, if I want to publish a book, a 36 color or 48 color, whatever is that called, on jihad and extremism, believe me, I'll get a publisher in 24 hours. If I want to publish a book to counter that, I'll not find a publisher. And that's why the whole argument that rather than F-16s, I absolutely agree. Whether if one good publishing house was supported, that would have made much of a difference. I'll quote an example. There was an excellent book, which I'll not name because the event is recorded. There was a book which State Department decided to, or say Organization S in the United States decided to support in Pakistan. It was in Urdu. It was about jihadi and militant organizations in Pakistan. It was translated in English with US government support. It was poorly translated. But in comparison, there is another book called Fazail-e-Jihad by Masood Azhar, a terrorist manual in Urdu. That is now translated in English and it's available on the internet. The militant organizations or the extremist forces within many Muslim countries appear to be very disciplined and organized. And those forces which have to counter them, and this says a lot about weaknesses within the Muslim world, but also about weaknesses about their supporters outside, including United States. One other point, just because we were talking about books, if there's one book, I had few books I was reading while coming from New York, and one book, if I can really project, and I was very glad to see its author sitting in the audience, that's why I want to mention, for those of you interested, Reason, Freedom and Democracy in Islam, written by a leading Muslim reformer, Abdul Karim Surush, who I'm glad to see sitting here. So there are many books written by Muslim reformists who have made their point very strongly, but I don't see that there were any efforts to project those works. Last point, I think this point is well taken, that it's also about policy. When President Obama made his speech in Cairo and then in Turkey, as I'd mentioned, his ratings, look at the ratings in the Muslim world, those went up, except in some countries, in Pakistan, tragically, because primarily, people looked at Obama administration. They thought there's Barack Hussein Obama has won, so drone attacks in Pakistan tribal areas will stop. Because of that, just linking of whole US policy with one issue, Obama's ratings went actually down, then were below than even what Bush had for some time. So yes, the whole issue of perception, the whole issue of image is inextricably linked with what US can do to change and reform Muslim countries.
Okay, so let's take a second round. Where is the mic? Okay, good. Let's 1, 2, 3, 4. Make it brief, please. No, sorry. Yeah, it will come to you. If you just make it brief so that you can have more questions, the second round, the third round.
Thank you. My name is Radwan Masmoudi. I'm with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, and thank you for a wonderful opportunity and great panel. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about on Islam and democracy. We've been doing it for 10 years, and I imagine we'll continue to do it for many, many years. I'd like to take a small issue with what Jennifer said, is that there is that democracy is misunderstood or has a bad name in some quarters of the Muslim world. There's been a lot of polls that have been published in the last 3 years or 4 years that show that democracy is still very popular in the Arab and Muslim world. People want democracy. In fact, it's even more popular than it is here in the United States, according to some polls. So the only problem or the only question is that they don't see it as secular democracy. They want democracy, but they also want Islamic values, Islamic principles to play a role in the society and in the government. That's the dilemma. They want democracy, but what kind of democracy? The question of Abdul Naim about should the United States even try to promote democracy? If you ask this question in the Muslim world anywhere, the normal answer is no, we don't want the United States to promote democracy, just stop supporting dictators. This is the normal answer. Everybody will tell you, just get out of supporting the business of supporting regimes that are oppressive. The problem with that approach is, what is the alternative? If the United States stops supporting Mubarak in Egypt, or all of these regimes in the Arab world, then there's going to be a vacuum. What is the alternative to these regimes? And that's when I think you get into the question of, okay, how do we prepare for an alternative, that is better than these existing regimes? We don't want to replace these regimes with regimes that may be even worse than what we have now. So I think the United States has to prepare for that by supporting values of democracy. Finally, the last point is, again, about the question of secular democracy. I think the Bush administration in the initial 3 years had a good start, but then got stuck on this issue of secular democracy, because we always want to promote democracy, but only secular democracy. And therefore, we have refused to deal with the reality as it is on the ground. We try to support only some friendly groups or friendly scholars or friendly leaders who have no real legitimacy. And we refuse to deal with the popular movements in the region that are not necessarily secular. Thank you.
Thank you. Right on this side, yes. And then back behind.
Thank you. My name is Rana Fawad. I'm a freelance journalist. First of all, I agree with Mr. Naim on the issue of libraries. I think this is one of the best things I saw in this country. And then I read Benjamin Franklin's biography, and I was really amazed that the guy who could not go to college or university had this vision to spread the library system in this country. And I belong from Lahore, basically, and I remember from those days that 2 libraries were very important in Lahore, and Hassan will remember that, British Council Library and American Center Library. A student would love to go there and have their cards. So if that could be started again. My question is about the credibility of the United States telling others to start democracy, or in that, the case in point I would like Hassan to answer and the others, is the madrasas in tribal areas. As far as I know, I grew up during Cold War when the United States was, the best friend was a dictator in my country. In those madrasas, you can say venom was injected. Extremism was injected to promote jihad. And now, when we hear from the United States or from any scholar, Pakistan needs to do some reforms, madrasa reforms, that is just offensive. That cannot, coming from the United States that invested money and literature in those madrasas to promote extremism, and now telling the Pakistani people that you need to reform those madrasas is just adding to the confusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take right here, and then in the back, and then we'll come to this side.
Thanks. Yeah, Joe LeConte with the King's College in New York. Thank you, panel, for a terrific discussion. What I want to push you on a little bit is how we can move toward a more democratic and just system of governments in Muslim-majority countries if we don't kind of deal with a couple of issues that I keep hearing about. And one of them is the idea that America's moral inconsistency is a very discouraging thing. And I'm not going to defend policies, U.S. foreign policies, that most of us would agree seem wrong-headed and immoral. But I want to say that that's, number one, not the whole story of U.S. foreign policy, of course. And number two, we just can't wait for moral perfection in U.S. foreign policy before we really challenge Islamic societies to reform. Because choices of statesmen are always going to be constrained, just like they were during the Second World War, when the Allies have to make an alliance with the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis. An uncomfortable choice. Those choices were constrained by the choices of a previous generation. And in a lot of ways, the choices of our statesmen now are constrained by the limitations within Islamic society. So I'd love to see more emphasis, if we could, on the potential in those societies to adopt some basic principles. And I'll just name three. Separation of powers, government by consent, equal justice under the law, and religious freedom as the first freedom in any just society. Those are the issues on the table. And unless Islamic societies begin to grab hold of those principles, which in the Anglo-American tradition we hammered out in the 17th and 18th centuries, unless you start moving in that direction, if you keep waiting for U.S. foreign policy to become the foreign policy of Mother Teresa, there'll be no change. There'll just be no change. So I'd love to get your response to that. Thanks.
Thank you. In the back, and then we'll take a round of responses and a round of questions to follow.
Yeah, I'm Imtiaz Yusuf from Georgetown University. My question is about the age of democracy in the Muslim world. We say they are 50 years old and they've not matured yet. So when they will mature, I think the model which will emerge will not be the same as we see in the American or the European world. Is the West ready to accept that kind of a model of democracy or not? Thanks.
Okay, around Hassan.
Just start briefly about the madrasa question. I agree with the questioner absolutely about that there was during the Afghan war, there's this whole issue of West supporting in some ways Pakistani government's policy, but we must recognize that, for instance, specifically in case of Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and especially those madrasas which today are a major security concern, those were also primarily funded by Saudi Arabia. Now there is so much empirical evidence. The United States was supportive of Pakistani groups who were fighting the Soviets, but the decision to go for some of those Wahhabist or whatever Salafist, whatever name we want to give, those madrasas were funded by Saudi Arabia. Pakistanis wanted those Afghan orphans to rather come into the country, go back and fight. So the responsibility for those very narrow-minded, bigoted textbooks, those were used, also, I would say, primarily lies also with Pakistan and Afghanistan. Yes, the support which came from outside was problematic as well. Very briefly about the other issue about the U.S. foreign policy, yes, I agree with you absolutely. No one should wait in the Muslim world for or from outside that the foreign policy will change. But there are many missed opportunities. For instance, a massive lawyers' movement that took place in Pakistan in the last year of Musharraf regime. Hundreds of thousands of lawyers came out on the streets. Civil society in the United States helped them. Lawyers, the Bar Association in New York came out to support them very strongly. The US government was just quiet vis-a-vis talking to Musharraf or just mentioning that all the atrocities that Musharraf regime adopted against those lawyers. So those issues become the central theme. People in Pakistan, for instance, argued why Musharraf was still supported and those progressive forces were not supported. But in principle, I absolutely agree with you. Side by side with that criticism, or that will never be perfected. But then the question remains, how will we empower that change? My argument was madrasa reform is not the way. No one stops from investing in educational reform.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Just a couple of quick points. First, about
Thank you. Anybody else?
Just a couple of quick points. First, about the books. Unfortunately, because of the nature of many of those regimes, not all the books that are banned are religious books. A lot of books that are critical of regimes are banned as well. Go back to Cities of Salt to the present. A number of books that are critical of regimes that are purely secular and liberal have been banned. And I agree that this issue has to be addressed and part of the larger issue of the whole business of exporting books. There are two points I would like to make about the question of U.S. policy. I do agree 100% that if they are going to wait only on U.S. policy to create reform from within those societies, they'd have to wait till hell freezes over. That change has to occur from within rather than from outside. Even Muslim regimes tell us, well, Islam is not inimical to democracy. Well, certainly Islamic dictators are, Islamic autocrats are, and these are the autocrats that have ruled those Muslim societies for centuries, and they have kept their rule because of the fear of fitna, that they told their people that if you oppose the regime, that might create sedition or fitna, and so therefore do not get involved in that. And so they got their establishment Islam to support that position. So they created two layers of Islam, establishment Islam and civic Islam. And civic Islam has opposed establishment Islam, but they work together. And the role of foreign players, foreign actors, is that for years, because either the Soviet Union or terrorism since 9/11, we have to a large extent emphasized stability over democracy. And so we look the other way every time those regimes got engaged in practices that are anti-democracy and undemocratic. Or we look the other way. So they have been empowered by the perception that they are needed in our effort. And some of us told us that very clearly. They have learned to play the game. They have become very smart at it. And during the Cold War, they said whenever a regime would say they are anti-communist, well, we go and embrace that regime. They learned to use the same language after 9/11. Anti-terrorism, we go and embrace the regime. And that's why the whole push for democracy slowed down, because of those issues. So they felt empowered and in order to push to keep democracy from challenging their rule. And that's what we have now, unfortunately. But you are absolutely right that a change has to occur from below and from within, not from the outside. And I'm encouraged by the fact that we have a number today of Islamic reformist thinkers, both in the Middle East. Somebody mentioned Abdul Karim Sarouj, Muhammad Shahrur, Hassan Hanafi in there, and then we have Naeem Abul Fadl and so on in here, Tariq Ramadan in Europe, and we have a number of people. But the challenge to all of these thinkers is that like Harkoon, Muhammad Harkoon, to listen to him and keep awake, you have to have a PhD in philosophy to stay awake. And so many of their writings have to be simplified, translated into the local language, and in order to be understood by high school dropouts and high school students, the same population that bin Laden speaks to.
Okay. Jennifer?
In closing, I'd actually like to take issue a little bit with Professor Naeem on his comments about how there aren't shortcuts to democracy and we need to let others do it on their own in their own way. I think, first of all, there's at the very, very least a role for others in helping to remove some of the barriers that exist to development of good governance, rule of law, democracy. But I'd also like to advocate that there is a common human value in supporting human dignity. that is not about America exporting American culture, that I think really calls us to be involved in some of these projects, but of course in a way in which we're really listening to domestic partners in other areas to understand from them their needs. But part of the luxury I enjoy of having the freedoms I've had in this country, economic standard of living that's enabled me to pursue education and some finances to travel is, I think, hopefully to be involved in helping with some common human values and human betterment.
Okay. I do have, because specific points put to me, and then we'll do another round. And very briefly, on Ridwan's point about what's the alternative. Of course, I think the point is that I think removing obstacles is the major issue. And given the perception problem with foreign policy of the United States, and people's anxieties about the real objectives and the conspiracy sort of attitude, promoting actual positions of Muslim scholars, Muslim intellectuals, or civic engaged public intellectuals is delegitimizing, not legitimizing. So the alternative, but in any case, I mean, this question could be back and forth. I mean, I don't believe that you can promote democracy from without. Some of us do think you can do that. But we cannot resolve the question on this at this level. One point about, I think what Emile was saying about Islamic, he said Islamic despots are. One of the difficulties I have, this term Islamic, we tend to apply it rather indiscriminately. I mean, there is Islamic this, Islamic that, and when I say this often, you know, people make the point very dramatically. If you travel around Cairo, for example, or Damascus or anywhere, you'll find Islamic butchery, Islamic laundry, Islamic. The term is so diluted in the way that we apply it indiscriminately. I think what I tend to think of, whether despots or dictators or Democrats, they are just Democrats who happen to be Muslims, rather than Islamic Democrats. Or there are despots who happen to be Muslims. So it is not that the state or the people, the ruler becomes Islamic because they happen to be Muslim or use an Islamic discourse even. That's one point about the question of age of democracy, because that was also somewhat relevant to me. The point I think it's a very well taken point. That is, when we talk about democracy, we should be honest about, because it is about the people's choices. It is not about they're making our choice. And I think we don't have the sort of the self-confidence and the willingness to play the game truly. I mean, there is nothing worthwhile that is risk-free. If you are really in the business of promoting democracy and the people of Gaza elect Hamas, you have to work with Hamas. Because that's what democracy is. You can't say, sorry, wrong choice. You have to choose someone we like, or else we don't support your democratic institutions. Those are the questions that stay with people's minds when they be suspicious about what the United States can do. What Jennifer said, I agree with, that is actually, which is, when I said the rest of U.S. foreign policy, that includes human rights. So there is, in fact, a credibility gap with the United States about human rights, because the United States is not willing to apply the same standard that it claims internationally on itself. The only country which has a government which has not ratified the Rights of the Child Convention is the United States of America. The other country is Somalia. So this is the company you keep. Somalia, which had no government since 1991, and the United States, the most powerful, the most enlightened, the most democratic, blah, 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 with really, honestly, with due respect, stand in line with the international community in promoting international institutions. And then you can have the credibility to talk about the principles that you were talking about the rule of law and democracy and so on. So we'll take one and two, and we'll go back in the, yes. Then right in front, and then in the back, and then we'll take a round of responses.
Thank you. My name is Anwar Hadam from Algeria. Actually, I want to approach the thing from another perspective, that Candidate Obama, he struck me with one sentence, one statement that really, I think it was very important to say that we need to change the mindset that led us to this mess at the international level. And I believe that is the question that need to be addressed, I believe, and at least by the academia, and how to change the perception in the West regarding the future and regarding the Muslim world. Are we envisioning a multi and diverse world? Or because I was really frightened by the statement of Prime Minister Aznar when he said there is only one civilization. That's really a very serious statement that need to be addressed by the academia. We don't believe that there is only one civilization. So the question is, are we ready really to envision the world in a multi and in a diverse approach, and what is the place of the Muslim and the Muslim world in this? The first thing that you have to understand, and quickly, is that while you have enjoyed to have founding fathers that have established foundation for this republic, they have founding text. We, almost all the Muslim world countries, we have no founding text that was really by the people, for the people, and from the people. So you have to understand this, change this mindset, not look at our Muslim world just only an arena of oil and gas and vital resources, but rather they're human beings as well. So they need to be considered as such, and helping them in any way that they will have to express themselves by themselves, for themselves, for a multi-diverse world, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you. Right in front of you, and then the lady in the back, and right here in front.
My name's
Keep it brief, please, and as much.
I'll be very brief.
Question-oriented.
Okay. My name's Everett Price. I'm a student here at Georgetown University. I just wanted to get some reactions from any of the panelists, really, about, in comparison, the Bush administration to the Obama administration on some of the points that we've been talking about. Because it seems to me that under the Bush administration, when he did speak about Islam, it was nothing really but effusive praise. He did coin terms like GWAT, which led to a broad brushing of the Islamic world and that sort of thing, but perhaps unintentionally more than anything. But like, really, what are the substantive differences that have taken place from the Bush administration and the Obama administration that have led to more effective relationships, or not, with the Muslim world? Also related to the fact that it seems like one interpretation now is that the Bush administration had obviously a very ideological foreign policy in which we did not back down on questions of dissidents like Ayman Noor in Egypt, or on human rights in China. But now we take a more pragmatic approach in which we start to mute some of our criticism on some of these issues. There was a article in the Washington Post not too long ago about how Kifaya, also in Egypt, is somewhat discontented with Obama in the follow-up to the Cairo speech. So I just wanted to know more about what that comparison is and where the effectiveness lies.
The lady in the back, and then in front here, and please keep it brief so the panelists have a chance to respond.
My name is Mina Marifat, and I teach here at Georgetown. I am questioning one premise that seems to be an underlying assumption that Islam is equal to politics. I think that's a very recent issue, and that it should be disassociated in some ways in some of the discussions. And the second thing is that you talked about education, and I'm sure I agree with most of what you said about books and promoting education. But there's another aspect, I think, that if you educate the American population, and the educational system in America endorses educating about Islam in its broadest sense, about its cultural values, its artistic values, its architectural values, and other cultural aspects, what will happen is what Jennifer Bryce said, that indeed the Islamic world too will pay attention to those things themselves.
Thank you. One last question here front, and then the panelists will round up the final comments.
Alfred Steppen, a question for Naeem. It revolves around Hamas. You're one of the few people today who said that Hamas, their victory should have been recognized. I feel it should have been, in the sense if we're going to talk about democracy, and it's still misrepresented. I mean, so I'd like to know, I mean, the New York Times often refers to it as a sweeping victory of Hamas. Hamas actually won by 4%. The first past the post system gave Fatah a huge defeat because Fatah ran 2 candidates many times. But this is just basic political analysis. I think if Hamas had run and it had ruled, and given that fact that overwhelming percentage of surveys in Palestine for 40 years have said they would accept a 2-state solution, and if Hamas was absolutely against it, they would have lost the next election. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. Since a very specific question, I agree. I think seriously, Hamas is just a political organization like any other political organization. It won an election, it would have lost the next election, or lost the one after. The point is to normalize sort of so-called political Islamist and make it just simply like everybody else. And I think that will play for more stability and more credibility of our claims that we are at least in principle committed to democratic governance.
Just in 2 sentences. One, I really want to appreciate what the lady said, and I agree with that entirely about using those tools and those ideas for reaching out. Secondly, in reference to the question about differences between Bush and Obama, with all the due respect to the Republicans in this hall, I think Bush came across as quite arrogant when he talked about enforcing or introducing democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq, whereas everyone knew that that was not the core goal or idea. The way it is different is, as I see, President Obama very clearly talks about a dialogue with Iran and not very threatening. For the Muslim world, it was great to see that he was talking to Netanyahu, not necessarily in the same way that US talks to the Palestinian leaders, but there was some balance or more open effort to engage both sides and some neutrality in that aspect comparatively. And very clearly, Obama is not cozying up to the military rulers and military leaders in Pakistan. And the Kerry Lugar bill, for instance, very clearly says more engagement with hospitals and schools and reconstruction. To me, that's a huge difference.
Thank you. Emile?
Professor Cole, in his recent book, talked about Islam anxiety in America and America anxiety in the Muslim world. And it seems to me to overcome those, engagement is the logical way. Now, to engage logically and successfully, it seems to me we need to engage credible indigenous organizations, including primarily Islamic political parties. And some parties will pose a challenge. Hamas and Hezbollah are on the US list of terrorism. So how do we engage them? That is a challenge for policymakers, is above my pay grade, but we need to engage them. The point about Hamas, there was, and I'm not speaking out of school, except to say that there was some debate within the US government after the election in 2006. That debate did not last more than 48 hours. The debate was, one view argued that we should give him 6 months, because tomorrow morning Hamas would have to engage Israel. They would have to engage Israel on work permits, on the power grid, on daily life. And if they don't do it, then we always have the ability to do something else. And the other view, no, we have to not accept the results and undercut that. Unfortunately, that other view won. And I am really convinced that the war in 2008, 2009 was a result of that decision not to recognize that election result. And finally, I would say that, of course, Islamization within Muslim politics is a small minority, there is no doubt, but that only a small segment of the 1.5 billion Muslims are engaged. They view their actions in politics, economics, law, education based on Islam. That's what we call the Islamized portion, segment of Muslim politics. But traditionally, of course, in Sunni Islam in particular, Islam was a total way of life. I mean, the so-called 3 Ds in Arabic, Islam, Deen, Dunya, Dawla. And so, I mean, Muslims over the centuries did not, especially in Muslim majority countries, did not really differentiate. I mean, Islam was a total way of life. And so that's why when people talk about Islam and politics is really part of that. And again, I agree with you that we ought to differentiate between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. I mean, Sunni Islam, as Hassan indicated, there was no authorities. The people just read ijtihad and they become mujtahids, any Muslim. Whereas in Sunni Islam, you have the ayatollahs and authorities and they dictate. In Shia Islam, sorry.
Jennifer?
Okay, just quickly about Islam being not just political. Yes, I mean, certainly I agree. It didn't mean to come off that way. I think it's just that today, because the topic of the panel is focused on democracy promotion, there's been a focus on politics. On the question about differences between President Bush and President Obama, just two. One is President Bush had an minister for USAID and an ambassador for U.S. religious freedom. President Obama does not yet. But more positively for President Obama, a difference is that in President Obama's Cairo speech and in other settings, he did not use a phrase, he did not use the phrase, the Muslim world. And I think that was a really positive step forward. He talked about Muslim communities, countries with Muslim populations, Muslim majority countries, because it is not the case that I, as a non-Muslim, live on planet A and Muslims live on planet B. In my day-to-day life in Princeton, New Jersey, Muslims are part of the world I live in, and we live together in the same community. So I think that was a really positive step forward.
Thank you so much. Let's thank the panelists, please.